go over a few definitions. You can define cultural capital as intellectual or other knowledge that reflects, reproduces class relations. So an easy example is like knowledge of art history, right? So if you know a lot about art history, you may be able to schmooze with high-class people that then get you a high-class job. But let's say if you don't know art history, you may not be able to schmooze as well, and so you have trouble getting a more high-class job. This is obviously an oversimplification, but so the idea of cultural capital is to just think of knowledges, tastes, as things that can help you get ahead. It's not only think of money or social connections or whatever that can help you get ahead, but also think of knowledges. Next, gentrification. I defined it as the local improvement of housing and infrastructure and the associated displacement of one class from their neighborhood by a higher class. And importantly, there's lots of research out there that explores how gentrification reflects, reproduces class tension. So you can imagine, if you're in a neighborhood and people who look differently from you are moving in and you're being forced to move out, it can create some negativity between class groups. Also importantly, gentrification absolutely is happening in the neighborhoods surrounding the Brooklyn Zen Center. It's in Gowanus, technically, but Carroll Gardens is right there, Park Slope is right there. These are very heavily gentrified neighborhoods of Brooklyn. Next, mindfulness. I define mindfulness as the use of 3 core attentional skills: concentration, power, sensory clarity, and equanimity. Briefly, mindfulness practices were mostly developed in Asia, and over the past 50, 60 years, they've been transplanted into the West, into America. And importantly, the groups of people who are engaged in mindfulness practice in modern America are predominantly white and upper middle class, and that has to do with a lot of factors having to do with how mindfulness practices were translated into the West, and what was going on historically and socially at the time. Lastly, the Brooklyn Zen Center is an example of one of the organizations that make up the modern American mindfulness movement. Basically, it started about 10 years ago in a basement, a few friends getting together to sit, and over the years developed momentum, attendance increased, they went to a few different spaces, and they now have a beautiful new space and lots of programming, and attendance is going really well. So that's a brief history of the center. And another thing that I explore in my project is scale, and I define scale colloquially as a set of nested Russian dolls ranging from the body to the global. And importantly, Olivia touched on this too, but the nation state is absolutely a predominant scale in geographic discourse. And in my project, I was also exploring other scales more seriously. And so, for example, I explored learning mindfulness at the scale of the individual body. Right, this is something that happens to individual bodies, and more specifically, I thought of acquiring mindfulness as kind of a form of cultural capital. Right, so it's a knowledge, it's a bodily disposition that can be thought of as a kind of cultural capital. So with these definitions in mind, we can explore my central questions. And the first question is at the local scale. And so as a local organization, how does the Brooklyn Zen Center both reflect, reproduce, and challenge the class tension associated with gentrification and the mindfulness movement? And my second key question is at the scale of the individual body and interpersonal relationships, so a much smaller scale. How does the acquisition of cultural capital in the form of mindful awareness by members of the Brooklyn Zen Center both reflect, reproduce, and challenge the class tension associated with the mindfulness movement? In order to answer these questions, I conducted interviews with members of the Brooklyn Zen Centers. I conducted 15 interviews, lots of hours, and it was just really, really interesting and rewarding experience overall. So this is what I found. In terms of the local scale, the members of the Brooklyn Zen Center are absolutely predominantly white and upper middle class. And as a result, people of color and lower class people often feel alienated in that space. And so in that way, they're reflecting and reproducing a lot of the trends that we see with gentrification, with the modern American mindfulness movement. However, that being said, the Brooklyn Zen Center is also engaged in a number of unique and interesting programming that challenges some of the class relations that are associated with gentrification in the modern American mindfulness movement. For example, they have continuing art exhibitions, and several of the art exhibitions that they've had revolve around issues of social justice. They're also heavily involved in an anti-gun violence campaign that involves hosting panel discussions at the Zen Center. I attended one of those, and it was really phenomenal. There was like 7 African-American panel discussions talking about gun violence in Brooklyn at the Zen Center, and there's a diverse group of people at the Zen Center. They're also holding a day of silence in a local park where they'll read the names of people who have died of gun violence. Also, they bring diverse speakers to the Zen Center. For example, Angel Kyodo Williams is a really predominant African-American Zen teacher, and she's very forward about thinking about race and class within Zen communities. And I attended one of the talks that she gave at the Zen Center this spring as well. And they have an inclusivity committee that started last fall, and the whole point of the inclusivity committee is to interrogate the programming and policies of the Brooklyn Zen Center to keep in mind inclusivity and make sure that their space is open as possible. And they also have a number of affinity groups. They have people of color sitting group. They have 12-step Sangha, meditation groups for college students, meditation after school for underserved youth in Brooklyn. They're really doing a lot of innovative stuff along those lines. Secondly, at the individual interpersonal scale, again, mindful awareness, it is kind of a cultural capital, right? It's associated with the white upper middle class. And so you can think of the Brooklyn Zen Center as kind of somewhere where people learn mindful awareness. It cites an upper class norm. So in a way, it's reproducing and it's reflecting class tension. But I also asked members of the Brooklyn Zen Center, how does mindfulness affect how you interact with people, especially people who are different from you socioeconomically? And they said some really interesting stuff. Overwhelmingly, it was positive. Overwhelmingly, it helps me get over distance in a really genuine way. And in terms of how that happens, I found 3 themes that kind of came out of my interviews. One was the production of subjective spaciousness. And as a geography major, I was really excited. 42% of interviewees mentioned it makes the space of myself larger. And that's something that I've thought a lot about personally, and it was really cool to hear other practitioners say that. Also, they talked about openness. Also, they talked about connection. I'm not going to go into what I mean by those, but those are kind of the mechanisms with which mindful awareness can help one develop genuine interclass relations. So, kind of in conclusion, what we see is reflection, reproduction, and challenging across the board, right? So the Brooklyn Zen Center is involved with the mindfulness movement. It's involved with gentrification. And it absolutely does reflect and reproduce a lot of the class patterns that we see with these larger scale phenomena. But at the same time, they're doing lots of really interesting things to challenge some of the class relations that go along with the mindfulness movement, that go along with gentrification. Similarly, with cultural capital, we see it reflecting and reproducing, but we also see it challenging in that mindfulness allowed you to interact with people across class divides. And lastly, scale, we see the acquisition of mindful awareness on individual bodies affecting class relations, which has nothing to do with the nation state. It has to do with individuals. And so we see like the causal power of individual bodies. So that's what I found. And there's one last thing. Social scientists often, say, oh, is my work going to do anything? And or is it just going to sit and get dusty on a shelf? So I just want to share that this was an email I got from the executive director of Brooklyn Zen Center. He says, it's so nice to read this and really helpful. I'll be sharing it with our inclusivity committee for discussion. So your paper will definitely have an effect on the way we think about things at Brooklyn Zen Center, which made me smile, and I thought that was really cool. And just a quick thank you to Brian Godfrey for awesome feedback, and more than that, just like positive energy whenever I went in to talk to him. It was really encouraging. Also, Joe for helping me with the first chapter, which was the kind of framework of the project to begin with. So thanks.
Thank you.